The idea behind central monitoring, ICH E6, well, R1, then R2, and now R3, and then ICH E8, R1. Dump the data into one Excel listing, dump the data into another Excel listing.
Oh, man.
So it's very time-consuming and not necessarily efficient or even high quality. Present the data. Can I present the data in such a way that it's so clearly obvious there's a problem that the answer is?
This is Trial and Error, where we dive deep into the world of clinical trials, uncovering the challenges, breakthroughs, and stories behind the scenes. Clinical trials are the backbone of advancing medical care, yet the administrative hurdles of getting sites started up and getting patients through the door often slows down progress. Today's guest is Nechama Katan, Director of Innovative Data Analytics at Pfizer, where she leads pioneering efforts in data science, forensic analytics, and business transformation. At Pfizer, Nechama has been instrumental in developing advanced analytics solutions, including leading a team through the creation of a strategic roadmap and business validation process for an innovative data product that is now utilized across multiple divisions. Her leadership has driven significant cost savings and operational efficiencies, particularly through the reimagining of Pfizer's risk-based monitoring processes. In addition to her role at Pfizer, Nechama also operates her own consulting practice, Wicked Problem Wizard, where she assists organizations in tackling complex technical challenges and delivering successful technology projects. For those who are unaware, a wicked problem is a problem with many interdependent factors, making them seemingly impossible to solve. Because the factors are often incomplete, in flux, and difficult to define, solving a wicked problem requires a deep understanding of the stakeholders involved and an innovative approach provided by design thinking. Through this practice, she leverages her deep expertise in data management and technology integrations to help businesses define, drive, and recover from difficult projects. Prior to her time in pharma, Nechama served as an adjunct professor in data science at Bay Path University and contributing faculty at Willamette, where she developed and taught courses in data analysis and visualization, with her teaching built on decades of real-world data experience across organizations such as Xerox and Kaiser. It's an honor to welcome Nechama to the show today. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent. Nechama, it's so great to have you on the podcast today. Really excited about our discussion. Thank you so much. First off, with everything, background, no one gets into this industry intentionally, or at least very few do. Maybe you could give everyone a bit of your background and how you got into clinical research.
Yeah, so I got a math degree from Barnard and then math degree from NYU and a statistics degree from Columbia, which I describe mathematicians as liberal arts engineers. We're qualified to do nothing, but we can learn anything. And then I needed a job, right? 2 master's degrees and financial obligations. And so I ended up working for Intel because I was on the West Coast, and that's who the largest employer was in my area. And I did data analytics for factories and CPU design and other type stuff, which started me kind of bouncing all around all sorts of industries. And when I moved to the East Coast, I was working for another large tech company doing printer metrics for the BI solution. I had yet to do pharma or supply chain. So when a recruiter reached out to me and said, "Oh, do you want a position at Pfizer?" I thought, "Hey, cool, it's pharma. It's a growing industry as opposed to the industry I had been in, which was shrinking." And I ended up at Pfizer doing risk-based monitoring. So I kind of fell into it with as everything else.
That's actually, it's so funny because, obviously I have a similar background coming in from like kind of the more traditional tech side and then going into pharma. I always find that people who maybe worked in like the more traditional tech and analytics have some, I guess, interesting perspectives on what the differences are. I think we've talked about it a bit, but what would you say are kind of the high level, the shocking differences you experience from going kind of analytics in, a more traditional industry than going to pharma?
So I think that there's a couple. The first of which that I'm still trying to get my head wrapped around is doing UAT, user acceptance testing, via an Excel spreadsheet of scripts and screenshots. And that this is the gold standard for testing and a necessary gold standard for testing. I came from a software background where you run unit testing and you run regressions and your test is all automated. And we haven't done screenshots of front-end systems in a very long time. And so just the way the pharma looks at software and analytics and systems is very challenged. So I think the nicest way of putting it, there's a need to really understand that for most pharma companies, because of the outsourcing models, for many pharma companies, they don't have access to their source data systems. And when they do get access to their source data systems, they don't know what to do with them. It's almost like taking a college student and handing them 5 TV dinners and saying, okay, make a new dinner out of these 5 TV dinners, right? So you're taking external, and terminal reports. So reports coming out of reporting systems that probably should never be exported to Excel to start with. So you're taking data from these different places. It's like you take all the peas from one TV dinner and the rice from another one, and you mash it together. And it's incredibly painful and time consuming compared to go buy some raw ingredients and make dinner. But if you've never done anything but cook from TV dinners, you don't realize that really what you want to do is go buy raw ingredients and cook from scratch, which is, for the analogy, it's go back to your source systems. Everything's in databases, everything's in tables. Actually do your reconciliation. Databases are great at saying, oh, I've got this table and this table, do a SQL join, run a test, and now I've got a reconciliation. In pharma, it's dump the data into one Excel listing, dump the data into another Excel listing, do a VLOOKUP, squint at it, look at it funny, and then take a UAT screenshot that you've reconciled it successfully.
Oh, man.
So it's very time consuming and not necessarily efficient or even high quality.
Yes, completely agreed. I think that there are a lot of things that we would all be better off adopting from other industries as well. Not just that, actually. And I mean, I think everyone in the room who understands what we're talking about understands what we're talking about. But my goodness, some of the Excel exports you can get from these portals are painful. I've seen nested hierarchical Excel formats where they'll merge a bunch of header cells for absolutely no reason. And then now you have to do another pre-processing step before you can even look at I just want a CSV. Or better yet, an API, not an active pharmaceutical ingredient for some of those listening. API is a technical term, application programming interface. It's how we can have machines communicate with one another. It would make all of our lives much easier. And if you have a vendor, please tell them open APIs are the way to go.
Open APIs, yes. I just did that. I walked through a conference and asked every vendor, do you have an open API? Yes or no?
Yeah, I had the wonderful pleasure of being at the Innovative Network gathering just recently, and I was in a room full of people talking about central monitoring. One of the big challenges is interoperability, and we had a whole discussion about open APIs, and it was so funny because one of the first reactions people had to open API, is that a security risk? Because the word open at first glance, or at least their first interpretation, is open means kind of, being open to the world. And I had to explain, no, it's more about documentation and visibility and so on and so forth. And then Michael from AWS, he's on the product team there for the health and life sciences, had this great analogy. He said, here's how you should think about open APIs. Think about your study as like the iPhone, right? An open API allows developers to develop on top of it. So you kind of want an app ecosystem, right? You want the ability to have apps. They're still secure, right? Yep. So it's nothing like some Windows 95, just like random install where you're like you're praying to God that it's not some virus. It's not that. And I just we had the funniest conversation about maybe having some kind of like Mac versus Windows. Do you remember those old commercials? Just doing that for the industry with oh man, that was really funny. I think this is a great segue to actually just your role in.
But there's actually one more topic on that, which is before we get there, which is validation of apps. So there is this sense, someone says, well, how do you validate a system? I gave a talk again last week, and the answer is you can't validate a manual process. So any software is going to be easier to validate than a manual human process. You can't validate an Excel spreadsheet. You can't control an Excel spreadsheet. You can fill it with formulas and everything else, but at the end of the day, you can't show an audit trail on what actually happened in that Excel spreadsheet. This notion that you need to go through huge, crazy hoops to validate technical solutions, but that manual processes are okay, is also a fascinating pharmaism.
Yeah, I don't know. You're right. It is so bizarre. The bar is so much higher for something that is, I guess,
traceable,
deterministic.
repeatable.
Deterministic. That's the thing, right? So with the same inputs, you're definitely getting the same outputs with a human. I mean, who knows, right? I think this is a great segue to just for the audience, maybe talk a little bit about kind of, so you're at Pfizer, what's your current role, Director of Innovative Data Analytics, what does that mean? And also, what does it mean to be a wicked problem wizard?
My current role is I was hired to stand up the central monitoring platform at Pfizer and to really build that team and understand how to use our vendor and the software. So I built the original team and then I passed it on once we got to a point where it was business as usual, so to speak, to an operations person, because I'm always off changing things and shifting things around. So right now, for the last couple of years, what I've been doing is coming in and solving whatever problem needs to be solved at the moment, generally around analytics, generally around data analysis. How do I get my data? How do I use my data? What do I do with my data once I've gotten and using it? And then how do I integrate that into ongoing existing workflows so that other people can do that? That's my role at my day job. Wicked Problem Wizard. So wicked problems are out of a paper that was written, and I can't remember the author's name right now, but the paper is Wicked Problems and Social Complexity. A wicked problem is when the key stakeholders in the problem can't agree on what the problem statement is, but actually what I find is they all use the same word to mean something different. So how do you implement Gen AI as a wicked problem? Nobody's ever done it, really. We don't know what that means. We don't know what all the pieces are, and we don't know when we've implemented it yet. Added complexity because while everyone's using the same word, they're looking at it from completely different frames of references. So they're looking at one person's from compliance, one person's from, let's say, the site, one person's from the pharma company. Everyone is looking at the same problem completely differently. And so they're not having the same conversation. They're in fact having multiple different conversations using the same words. So it appears like they're having the same conversation, but in fact they're not. And those are the kinds of problems that I find interesting. They live in the white space between silos, and pharma is a deeply siloed industry, partially because you have separation of roles. But even without that, it's just deeply siloed. And so wicked problems tend to live between data management and site operations, or site operations and clinical data review, or in all of that white space.
Would you say that wicked problems are not just about communication silos, but also about incentive structures? Or do you factor that into being a wicked problem wizard?
People's goals are different. So let's not worry so much about incentive structures, but goal structures, right? So every, an operations team, and again, this is all my personal opinion and not of Pfizer's or my employer, so you can edit that into wherever you want to. But everyone has a set of goals. And if I'm in data management, my goal is to show that data is reliable and fit for purpose. If I'm in operations, my goal is to execute the trial in the most efficient way possible. If I'm in medical, my goal is to make sure that the patient safety is ensured. And so I'll have different focuses, and those are going to drive how I look at a problem and different priorities. If I'm in process and training and someone says a process is broken, I might mean a process is broken, meaning it's inefficient and it's not working very effectively. But someone from regulatory is going to say, no, the process works, right? It's a documented, proven process. We've got all the steps laid out. We can show we followed all the steps, and it's a defendable process, right? Versus an efficient process.
What you're saying reminds me of kind of the classic business problem that most organizations have, which is just how do you serve all of the stakeholders in the organization, right? So,
and you don't.
And it seems exacerbated by the fact that a lot of people communicate very differently. How do you think that kind of just best practices around, systems of data in pharma exist because of this? For example, I think you had mentioned that, it takes much longer to get any kind of analytic system set up in the industry. Some of it's validation, some of it's probably this. I guess I'll pause there, but yeah.
So in many organizations, you have one database with your raw data coming in, your CRF data. You have a different database with your non-CRF data. Then you have your standardized data into one or two different standards. And then you'll have your ADAM data set, your analysis ready data set that would go to submissions. So you could have 3 or 4 different databases for a clinical trial, and 3 and 4 different systems and compute environments to access those databases, and 3 or 4 different sets of access controls for that data. And some of that's being driven by what's blinded and not blinded, and what's sensitive data and what isn't sensitive. But I don't know any other industry that puts so many different data systems in play.
And in this case, are you saying that the different data systems are even potentially different vendor databases? So you're actually using
completely different databases, completely different vendor databases. Yes, absolutely. Some of it's in-house, some of it's out external vendors. So you've got data coming in a lot of different ways, and then it moves substantially at each step as opposed to it's flowing across. So that's the first problem. Second problem is that vendors in pharma almost never have open APIs unless you're one of the newer vendors. And so your data that comes in is this heavily negotiated process. And in the old days, you used to get, I've been told, non-CRF data, so the non-case report forms, we call the generally ePros, ClinPros, all those external data files, used to get mailed on or shipped on hard drives or zip drives or whatever. Now, we might get them on an SFTP, but to get that data from the vendor to the sponsor company with some of the larger vendors is actually still a manual process. They haven't automated it. And so your data is just fundamentally behind these manual processes. And then the data shows up and then it's been dumped into a drive. Someone then picks it up, in some cases manually picks it up and pushes it into a data flow. But there isn't a lot of sophistication around data flow. And so everything is a one-off solution still. There's very few standards. The types of data flow that you can get with, let's say, banking or financial institutions. So I'm thinking of other regulated industries. The IRS. I can port my data to the IRS easier, I think, my pay stub data, than I can get my vendor data on a clinical trial.
Even healthcare data it's much better than it was, 10 years ago.
It depends where you're at. You're on the West Coast. Healthcare data under Kaiser Permanente is very, very different than healthcare data in non-Kaiser states, right? But yes, you can't. It's just data in general. The data is just not. The manual steps, manual processes, and people aren't even aware of what's possible. So what you largely have, in my experience, and I always get into trouble for saying this, is horses and buggies, and the horses are sick and the buggies are broken. But it more or less works, and it's faster, and it's on old country roads than walking. So we tolerate these really clunky, hard systems to run. And then we complain too much about being too busy to fix anything. And an IT person comes in and says, oh, I've got this Porsche. And what color dashboard do you want? And you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, right? I'm too busy with my horse and buggy here. And you're asking about, I have no context to have this conversation. And so they create a really fast car for which there's no roads. Either it's a great technical solution, the roads are my data flow, right? So roads are my data flow. If I don't have data engineering and data paths going, I don't care how fast you can move stuff on it. If I can't get my data, it doesn't help.
Yeah, I used to integrate with lab systems in a previous life. And so now I'm also acutely aware of it because of what we do at StudyOS. But even back then, working with labs, it was all SFTP folders and XML file outputs from like the 80s and just really, really painful integration.
JSON, maybe. Sometimes you get JSON.
If you're lucky.
It doesn't matter, but that's better than Excel. That's better than .xls.
No, it's better than .xls, or sometimes you get .xls, or it's one thing with a macro. You're like, why is there even a macro in this thing? You have no idea.
Or you get a Word document or a PDF file with all of the data. We still transfer data on PDFs and say, okay, everything's been dumped to a PDF output. Now you have to parse a PDF. Those are actually harder to parse than you would think.
This is my conspiracy theory, is that Microsoft in the 80s knew exactly what they were doing when they came up with ASP.NET and these PDF exporters and everything else. They were like, we're going to get you even more stuck in the industry. I have ideas, but why do you think so many of the vendors still just have essentially nothing when it comes to data transfer in a way that's what I would consider sane, like an API front end or anything else like that?
Because anyone who's been in this business for a long time is a fee-for-service business model, and they just simply have invested in future technology, and their customers don't know what to ask for.
I guess the $1 million question is, if we could solve this problem, how would we do it? What do you think? What's the move for the industry?
What's the move for the industry? So they've tried a handful of different things. So there's this temptation to leap over, right? Go from, we're in this manual process, we're going to go straight to AI, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think that's the move. Or we're going to go to crypto, we're going to use, cryptography and this and that and the other to do all sorts of fancy things. What's the impact if we could solve it, or how would we solve it?
How would we solve it?
How would we solve it? If I could wave a magic wand, I would just throw out all the existing infrastructure and start from scratch. But the challenge is that there's a lot of relationships, and so a lot of the stuff is built on relationships. So the real way you solve these problems is you start with a small use case, you prove it's successful, And then you grow on that use case. And then you build that use case rock solid with strong programming practices. Right? So one of the biggest problems the industry has is that we generally don't have in-house programmers. We hire vendors to do our programming, and they don't program to programming standards, and they create technical debt. And when you create technical debt, now nothing can be changed and fixed. And so you get a really bad sense of, great, you've given me a car and it does exactly one thing and it only turns left. And to make it turn left and right, I'd have to actually re-engineer the entire car because the person who designed it didn't understand what the requirements were. And so I think that making robust building blocks, there's some significant effort going on right now in the R space, and probably will happen in Python as well, is build some significant roadblocks on validated packages in R and Python that are extensible and can be built on. And if we did it as an industry, it actually wouldn't take that long. So there's a number of companies doing that. In the statistical programming space, there's less in the data management space.
So for some of those entrepreneurs listening to this podcast, I think some ideas might come from this very episode.
So there's that. But the second big gap that people aren't talking about that needs to be talked about is audit trail. So regulatory gave us 15 years to figure out central monitoring, and now they're getting a little bit like, dudes, figure this out and actually do this right. Audit trail, they're like, hello, we told you a long time ago to do audit trail. You've ignored it. Now it is important. Period. End of story. Full stop. And audit, if the regular data is completely impossible to find, the audit trail is even worse. And nobody understands how to find it. Nobody knows how to process it. And because it is too large to handle in Excel, it becomes the thing that breaks the existing systems. But regulatory agencies are saying, sorry, you're bad, figure it out. And that's where I think that's where if I had to pick something that could come in and fix something, it would be that.
For vendors out there, please just make it exportable at the very least.
Well, make it exportable with an open API or some other way to throw it into a data warehouse. There's some industry working groups that I sit on that we're trying to decide what kind of analysis should happen on it. Ask creative questions. What kinds of questions? People don't want to look at audit trail because it's not, you can't change it, you can't fix it. But in fact, you can see a lot of process information about how sites behave, which is really the power behind it. Do you have the right people logging in? Are they logging in at weird times? Are they data in inconsistent patterns, which makes you feel that there might be multiple people sharing a login? Are they entering it too quickly, too slowly? Are there large gaps in data entry? There's huge numbers of things you can do with audit trail that the industry needs to, again, build a library of scripts, some data visualizations. It's wide open. There's nothing there. So from a vendor's perspective, it's wide open.
I got another one for you. So because audit trails are quite difficult to access, one of the things that we do at StudyOS is we get every single data point every single day. And then we have an entire kind of lineage of that data point.
Yeah, and so once a day isn't going to give it to me, though.
No, I know. But one of the things that's interesting, you can do that. But one of the things that's interesting is you do actually see exactly what you're talking about, where occasionally you'll see sites just delete everything, right? So all of a sudden these rows are missing. And then suddenly there's another big bulk add. And it's because they're confused and adding data to the wrong forms, which you can get from just having this kind of meta information about the study.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So there's a huge amount of meta information that's available, and there's a huge amount of just behavior that you can see if you're able to access that. A lot of people have tried we dump the data every 4 hours. That's our audit trail, and it is kind of sort of, but not
very clunky.
It still needs, but then to read it right takes a lot of effort as well. Nope, it just doesn't replace a real audit trail.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, I agree with you totally. It's the only reason we do it is because the vendors unfortunately don't make it easy for us to get audit trail. Otherwise, we wouldn't use such a silly workaround. So on that note, though, you had mentioned the regulators are asking for audit data for people doing central monitoring, but just in general, right? Like you had mentioned, the central monitoring is pretty disconnected from boots on the ground operations and kind of this challenge with feedback loops. Kind of where are you seeing the challenges with implementation central monitoring generally, as it relates to kind of coordinating with other study teams?
So central monitoring, the idea behind central monitoring, ICH E6 R2, well, R1, then R2, and now R3, and then ICH E8 R1 are the kind of the key recs, and those are, I don't know how familiar the audience is, but those are our overall arching guidances that we follow. The idea was you take the risk, so it was look at systematic problems in study trials, not point problems or transcription errors. So SDV, source data verification, is what was entered in the source system, what was entered in the EDC, in the electronic data capture, right? And you compare the two and you say, they line up, okay, we're good, right? But a good example of that is if a site doesn't understand how to take blood pressure and they enter the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure in different backwards, let's say, right? So what could be entered in the system and what's entered in your EDC line up perfectly, but the data is still wrong because the site didn't understand what they're entering. So source data verification catches transcription errors, which don't happen all that often. They do happen, but they're not an ongoing systematic problem. What process control is supposed to do is look at process errors. Where do the sites not understand what's going on? Where have they hired new staff? Where is there confusion about the protocol? Where is there a lack of oversight? That's our proxy for we can't use the word fraud because fraud's determined by court of law and it implies intent, but you can have lack of oversight. So what process control is supposed to do is you identify what your risks are, you put things in place to measure them, and then you measure your process over time as it's behaving, and then as things show up in your process, you then take that to the site, to monitors, right? You have your monitors go to the site, talk to the site about this, get some information, and come back and say, hey, wait, that was an issue, it wasn't an issue, come back and see what the risk was, and then continue this loop. So a couple things happen. One is, all the central monitoring work happens, and then in most companies, the output of the central monitoring, which can be a huge amount of sophisticated statistics, becomes a CTMS tweet, 250 characters or less, text only, right? You're not supposed to be directive. You're not supposed to tell the site what to do, but you'll send a thing that says, let's take propagated vital signs. So propagated value, same value, or effectively the same value gets copied over and over and over again. This is usually a flag for something. So central monitoring will flag it. Clinical will review it and say, those values are within range. There's no safety concern, therefore no issue. So if the signal gets past clinical, then it can go to site operations, and site operations says, well, let's SDV the data. No, that's what they entered in source. Almost always that's what they entered in source, the same value, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not an SDV issue, but what you really need to do is go back and say, okay, please walk the protocol with me and show me how you're collecting vital signs. Or you need to talk to the site about the importance of vital signs. Or I saw a study, these types of things happen on studies. Every person who's ever worked a study has seen something like this. An ECG reading has 4 metrics, 4 intervals, and one of the intervals was identical for every patient, every visit. It's not possible, right? It's just medically not possible. But it was a reasonable number, so they SDV'd it. Yep, show me your system works. Like, let me see you do an EKG and see if that QRS interval is identical, right? Does your system even work, right? So you need to ask not a leading question, you need to ask an exploratory process question of the site, and that's not happening. We're not asking when we go to CTMS or clinical trial master system and is sending the monitor to the site. They're not going with, hey, they're going with, there's this weird data point, not, can you explain this? There's a weird data point, can you explain the data point? Not, the process that site is following doesn't make any sense. Can you explain the process you're using? And so the answer that comes back is, SDV the data, it's correct, close the issue. Total disconnect, completely disconnected.
Is that because, for what you were saying, you lose a lot of the fidelity of kind of the originating signal because of the nature of queries being super short, or is there something else that's kind of hampering community? Like, how come? Why is it that when the monitor's on the site and they have this information on hand, it's not kind of in their mental model to ask these questions?
6 monitors with central monitoring is, and you'll get 7 different answers. Everyone knows what SDV is. Nobody knows what SDR is.
Okay.
At a minimum, no one knows what SDR is. And monitors are about building that relationship with the site and talking site and having a feel for what's going on. They're not the data people. And so we're talking completely different languages. We're talking like this at each other, maybe like this. And so we're not sending signals that make any sense. Monitors generally don't understand what central monitoring is. They think it's reduced SDV or targeted SDV, which in theory it is. It's the outcome of monitoring has been targeted as reduced or targeted SDV. I still get, if you think there's a problem with the site, increase your SDV proportions. No, SDV has never found anything, will never find anything, and that's not the answer. So there's just a lack of understanding. And then central monitoring reduced the amount of SDV drastically. So it removed a large amount of monitoring budget from studies, which removes a large number of monitors. And I don't think the monitors are feeling warm and fuzzy about learning what central monitoring was. That meant that their jobs are going to go away. So I think that there's this conflict of interest there.
That's interesting. I haven't heard it described that way. I guess
SDV going from 100% SDV to 10 or 15% SDV, which almost everyone has done post-COVID, removes millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars per study, and is coming out of monitoring budgets. That's people.
I think there's a lot we could do to empower monitors even now that we're not looking at.
Well, we can teach monitors how to do really cool stuff, like look at their data and look at their analytics systems and understand what's going on. And now that they're not doing so much SDV, they should have time for doing that. But we are fast to remove things, and the industry isn't great about getting people convinced that they can or should be trained to learn the next cool thing. It's a very slow-moving industry, so it's easier to say, we're just going to get rid of those people and hire different people who do something else. It's different, but then the organizations that have put central monitoring, RBM, risk-based monitoring, and central monitoring in the monitoring teams are still challenged with this. It is not just people with central monitoring and data management. There's no good place to put central monitoring, which really gets back to data review should not be clinical data review, data management, central monitoring, and study management, each doing their own data review. There should be data review should be a data review, and it should be holistic. And that's going to take the industry a very, very long time because we have all of these silos and we don't know how to break down.
Preaching to the choir. I know exactly what you mean. So for the monitors out there, though, right? What do you think the translated definition is? So if it's not, reduced SDV, right? What is the, where we're going back to kind of talking about the App Store and open APIs, like what do you think the right language is for folks out there? What is central monitoring? What should you be thinking it is?
So you're not fixing the data, you're fixing the process. So any given data point is not the problem. It's what is that ongoing trend? It's where is the site behaving? What's happening at that site? That's what the monitors need to understand. And that they're actually very good at. So does the site, I can take central monitoring output and say the site looks confused. There's a lot of missing data. There's a lot of propagated values. There's a lot of missed data. So missing means I've got missing a field on a page. Missed means I've missed the page altogether. Like the site just isn't filling in the right pages and doesn't quite know what they're doing, right? A monitor should be able to pick up on the site doesn't understand the protocol. Right? So it's look at the process. Does the site understand it? Is the site following the protocol? And is the protocol followable? We made a protocol that's so complicated that we can't actually follow it reliably, or there's too much ambiguity in it and every doctor's interpreting it differently. So if I have an assessment that then triggers an event, let's say an assessment that triggers an on-site event, and one person reads the protocol as you get a yes on the assessment, you show up on site, and the other reads it as you get a yes in the assessment and the clinician judges whether or not you need to bring that person on site. If the language is ambiguous on the protocol, and I've seen protocols where that kind of language is ambiguous, monitor is the first person who can see that. Hey, explain to me, walk the protocol, right? I love that. Walk through the protocol. Tell me what happens, right? Show me what you're doing. And you go to 3 different sites and you get 4 different answers from 5 different people. Feed that back to the sponsor company and say, hey, this is confusing. This is confusing. Huge amount of power in what monitoring does when monitoring does well, right? How well does the site understand the study? That's a conversation with the site. That's not, give me all my files. I'm going to go sit in the back room and do SDV.
This reminds me a lot of what it means to be a good UX designer. So there's a really interesting parallel here, right? Which
Okay.
is you can have an application and people could be repeatedly failing it, or, they're not getting the outcomes that they want. And you show it to a UX designer and they go, oh, I think I know what's going on, but they're not going to prescribe a solution. What they're going to do is they're going to go to a bunch of your users and they're going to say, hey, I'm so glad you're using our product. Would you mind just walking me through how you've done that? And they'll just watch them go through every single page and every single button click. And then you go, okay, suspicions confirmed. When we get to this page and this button's over here, it's confusing to people. They don't know what they're doing. And they subsequently change the product. That just sounds a lot like a monitor and a protocol.
So if monitors are doing that, that's a huge amount of value add.
Okay.
If a monitor is chasing down, oh, go look at this data point, go look at that data point, go SDV this, go SDV that, they're not adding that value. So there's a lot of value they can add without becoming data heads. And then the vendors could provide tools that facilitated that, right? So if here's my other beef with the industry. So I've got data over here for my data management, data over here for clinical, I have data over here and data over here, and my central monitoring output's all the way over there, right? And now I'm trying to pull it all together onto my phone or my iPad to tell a story, and I can't find it, right? So it's all now sitting in my head. Well, most of us can keep 2 things in our head at once. If we're really good, maybe 3, really 1. And so it's like, forget it. I'll just go STV data. It's easier to sweep the floor than organize the cabinets.
If only there were a product on the market that was solving this problem.
And it's easier to, I'm guessing there are, but I'm not finding them. The other analogy I've heard is that we spend so much time mopping the floor that we're too busy to shut off the water. And in pharma, we have locked the water behind so many walls that we couldn't shut it off if we wanted to.
I actually asked an interesting question to the site management, like a head of site management just the other day. It was about the same question. So StudyOS does like a lot of what we're talking about. And one of the things I've always wanted to do, which we don't, is have like a site-facing page, right? So that sites could see this kind of metrics about themselves at first. And, who knows if this is something that sponsors, I'm not sure about what sponsors want and stuff, but I was talking to some of my friends who are site operators, and I said, well, would you want this information? And they said, of course, I don't want to get this sent in an email all the time. Like I just if you're seeing this on your site, just like let me have access to that so I could see it myself. And I said to him, look, I think you could do this yourself if you had access to your data. And I said, do you even get kind of a DM reporter module access or any way to just export the data about your site so you could do this analysis yourself? He's like, no, never. And then I asked the site management lady, I was like, do you think they would allow that? And she said, I've never heard any site ever ask to get exports of their own data like that before.
But that's an interesting question because patient access to data is just happening right now. Okay, so many sponsor companies are making patient data available. So patients are saying, look, I'm participating in a clinical trial. I'm investing time, blood, money to show up to this trial site. I want to see my data. You're taking all these measurements. In some cases, I'm very sick and I want to see my blood work. I want to see my test results. I want all of these things. Give me access back to my data. And that's becoming more and more common. So I think as patient access to data is becoming more common, site access to data should be feasible. But we're not even giving that data to the monitors. So that's the bigger problem, right? So we're not even giving that data to the monitors.
Yeah, it's ridiculous that we're not. And it's also ridiculous for the sites because especially these operational metrics, if you're going to be looking at the data entry cycle time and you're going to be sending them an email every other week about the timeliness on data, why not just have it available to them? Hey, by the way, these are all your open queries in an easily digestible way. And this is how long your average turnaround time is. Because for all you're running a lot of different studies and maybe that RA left recently and you didn't realize how big of an impact that's been on your data entry time because that's just not what you're thinking about on a daily basis, right? I'm going to pivot the conversation just one more time. Earlier, you had mentioned this somewhat broken flow, right? So we start with central monitoring and they're doing all of these analytics and you had used the word signal. And then at some point that signal turns into an issue. I have noticed personally that there's a lot of discrepancy in how we like to use these different different verbiage to describe what central monitoring does, the outputs of central monitoring. Could you educate us all on what at least you think the right words are to use for, when you identify something? And
so let's start before central monitoring. A risk is a theoretical risk that could happen on a trial, okay? So a risk could be, let's take a generic vaccine trial, right? So a risk could be misdosage of the vaccine. It could be adverse events, patient safety adverse events, right? My arm swells up. A risk could be the site doesn't keep track of who's a placebo and who's not a placebo. You get sent home with an app on your phone to fill in your symptoms and you don't fill it in. Those are all risks. These are all theoretical things that can happen on a trial. Issues are things that happened. So now I go off and I'm running my trial and I crunch a bunch of data and I find out that we've told everyone to vaccinate on the left arm and they're doing it half on the left and half on the right, and that the EPRO, the patient-reported outcomes and the surveys aren't being filled in, or the answers all look exactly the same, and so we've got some questions around that. Those are issues. Those are issues that show up. But between a risk and an issue is a bunch of data analysis that creates a signal. And here is where pharma has really been challenged. In the past, when you've done data management, is you've gone and you've said, okay, find a data point. A patient and said they took 50 Tylenols. Saw this on a trial. Well, 50 Tylenols is not compatible with life. Okay, it will actually kill you to take 50 Tylenols. Chances are they didn't fill in the pro the next day, saying they took 50 Tylenols the day before. Right, something else happened. So you write a query and you query that data point. And you say, okay, we think there's a problem. We send the query to the site. The site says, yep, checked it. They meant to put in 5, not 50. Fat fingered, we fixed the data, we're good. Or nope, we didn't check it. So that's a query. And queries are great. You ask a question, you get a yes, no answer. You fix something, you're done. Okay. A signal, though, says, I see a statistical anomaly. I call central monitoring middle school. The goal of middle school is to have everyone exactly the same. Right? That's the teacher's goals, that's the student's goals, that's everyone's goal, right? Everyone is exactly the same, and if you're lucky enough to be one of my children, you stick out as an outlier in middle school, and the goal of the process is to beat all the outliers down so that everyone is exactly the same. Okay. What happens, though, is that you pick up an outlier and something statistically flags. Now the question is, when it flagged, is that a concern? Is that really an issue? Or is it just a signal? So let me give examples of signals that aren't issues. I have a site in Puerto Rico. I run a demographics mix across my study. It's global. And it says, whoa, I don't have any other sites with 100% Hispanic people. But the site's in Puerto Rico. I don't care, right? That's not a problem. Right? That's a statistical signal. That site's an outlier, but it's not an issue. Same notion. I've got a site with an Asian doctor and 100% Asian patients in Toronto. Again, might not be typical for Canada, but given who the physician is who's running the site, generally people tend to go to doctors who look like them if they can. A high proportion of Asians going to an Asian doctor in a city with a large number of Asians. Again, not a problem. But same study, I have a site in Puerto Rico and no one over the age of 50 smokes, drinks, or has sex. And that's a cultural problem because my guess was that the site was filled with site people who were the children. The average age of the site was 65. So the people asking the questions were either the age of these people's grandchildren or children, and they felt culturally deeply uncomfortable about asking their elders about personal habits that were very personal. And so they just didn't ask the question, and they just filled it no. So that's now an issue. And so this is where you cannot, right? Statistics, correlation is not causation. The example I gave at a conference recently is we all know you can actually correlate meat consumption to birth rates. Countries with higher meat consumption have lower birth rates. Without fail, just map it. You can do it at country level analysis. It happened. It works. This does not mean that eating meat is a contraceptive. It means that rich people have fewer children statistically overall. The wealthier you are, the fewer children the easiest way to get women to stop having children is to educate them. And education and wealth go hand in hand. And so what you're seeing is that same meat consumption will track to the number of women getting degrees or going through school, right? The number of years a woman's in school. And so you need to separate. And this is where pharmaceuticals haven't dealt well with ambiguity in the past. So now what do you do with I have a problem, but it's not a yes/no answer. It's I need to go look at it. So central monitoring produces signals. Signals need to be then evaluated to see if there are issues. Issues get sent to CTMS, and then actions from many of the central monitoring platforms, you take your signal and you make an action, you choose to act on it, and you send an action to CTMS, but it goes to CTMS as an issue. The CTMS says, here's an issue, and then the site says, here is the response or the action they took. So action gets used. Back to that wicked problem of the same word to mean two different things.
Right.
An action can either be an action out of a central monitoring system or an action from an issue reported to a site.
And I didn't hear anything in that about utilizing, monitors' wealth of knowledge to kind of look at that signal and say, hey, actually, maybe this is what's happening at the site, or at least.
Well, yeah. So generally, the study team does that, has that conversation. And that study team can choose or not choose to have monitoring representation on it to have that conversation. But yes, the conversation of understanding a signal should be data management, central monitoring, clinical study management. Study management's where the monitors come in. And then quality. The quality kind of comes in and says, no, go look at it anyway, right? So you get some interesting problems. So you'll have, here, let me give another example. You have a heart rate, systolic, diastolic blood pressure. So all of your blood pressures are listed as 117 to 121. Okay, so most people's blood pressure ranges. If you go into the doctor, your blood pressure will range maybe from 105 over something to 120 over something, 130 over something. But the entire site had very tight range of blood pressures. They sent this to clinical. Clinical's question is there a medical concern? Nope, there is absolutely no medical concern. These are within normal ranges for blood pressures. Yeah, it's a little bit over 120. We don't care, 121, 122. These are not a clinical concern. And so what happens? Close the signal. No, right? Is there a safety concern to the patient? But then is there a site operations concern? Why is the site entering data that's so close? And statistically on this trial, the data is much higher range, right? It might range from 105 to 140. So that's where now I need to go to study management and say there's a site operation question. And that's where you have to have multiple stakeholders having the same conversation. Because there's a difference between the clinical saying there's no patient risk. And the study operation, the assumption is that there's a lack of good understanding about what the site should be entering for blood pressure. I.e., they should be measuring it and actually entering it, as opposed to making up a number that's between 117 and 121. And so that becomes now, does the site understand the importance of blood pressure? Does the site understand the context under which it's being collected? Are they actually collecting it? Do they have blood pressure cuffs? Do they work? Do they know how to use them? Right? All those types of questions. And so it has to happen collaboratively, and that's where it's not happening. We're having individual conversations as opposed to holistic conversations.
Sometimes it feels like...
we use the same word multiple ways, sometimes in the same sentence.
Absolutely. Sometimes it feels like almost all of these conversations ultimately loop back down to better communication, better collaboration.
And then leveraging data and data systems to make that possible. Right? Can you make the data accessible so people look at it? My biggest career thing was at one point I presented some data about a risk, and a signal that I found, and I'd been arguing with them about it, and what we saw was this data, and then a drop, and it went zeros. And it wasn't supposed to. It should have been a uniform distribution across the study. And the study manager, who was an executive director at the point, looked at the data and went, oh, shit. It's like, okay, I'm done. He saw there was a problem. We went off. We talked to a bunch of sites. It turns out that somebody had given some bad information to someone, and there were a bunch of sites that didn't know what they were supposed to. They were just doing the wrong thing. So it got fixed. But, can you present the data? Right? That's always my thing. Can I present the data in such a way that it's so clearly obvious there's a problem that the answer is, oh, shit.
I think if anyone in the operations side is looking at this, the thing to urge is that when you're looking at data or you're investing in something like central monitoring, it's not just a data thing. It's an insight into the very operations and processes of your studies. Sure, it's a data thing. Maybe you don't feel like you're a data person, but the output is what is critical, and that is an insight into your operations.
And we tolerate needing to understand huge amounts of data in our lives, be it financial data, health data. We are inundated with data. This argument, this is, oh, no, I don't do data, is not true for most of us anymore. We have
Right.
data coming at us for everything. People are wearing Aura watches and Blade and Fitbits and this and that. I mean, we have more personal health data being collected on us than ever before. So but the trick is to get that data in a way that we can do something with it. It's not to say, oh, wait, no, I don't do data. Someone else does data.
Wise words. This has been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you.
Is there anything you'd like the audience to know, and where can they find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn under Nechama Katan, or you can Google my name. That also works. Yeah, I'm interested in helping solve wicked problems for organizations and understand how do you get from business context to a technology and then to a workflow so that you can actually solve these problems and get out of that space where everyone just focuses on the tech. So thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Hey.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode of Trial and Error. Remember, every step forward in clinical research brings us closer to the next medical breakthrough. Our goal is to spread knowledge and improve the chance that life-saving drugs make it to market. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider rating us or giving us a review, as that really helps other listeners find the podcast. Most importantly, though, I'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out directly and say hello.